It's time to get your music radio ready with the Audio Skills Podcast. It doesn't matter what type of music you're creating or what gear you use. It's all about the technique. Get ready to turn your home studio into a place where your music goes platinum. Now give it up for your host, Scott Hawksworth.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Scott Hawksworth, founder of audioskills.com, back with you, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's Audio Skills podcast. We have got an awesome show for you today, and I think it's going to be particularly helpful for folks who are newer to music production, since we're going to be talking about getting started in music production with some help from my buddy Ben Runyan, who teaches music production at Drexel University, in addition to being a producer, and he's working on his latest album. So he's got a ton of experience, and I think it's going to be awesome. But before we get into all that, I wanted to go with the audio tip of the week. And on audioskills.com and on our YouTube channel, I offer up tips and tutorials and things like that. But I want to make sure that our podcast listeners can get some actionable takeaways they can get each week to help them make better music. And this week's tip is really applicable to anyone, no matter what skill level you have. If you're a beginner, more advanced, if you're producing music, or more specifically, you're mixing a song, my tip is this: make use of reference tracks. And this is something that I learned from Trina Shoemaker, who was the 1998 Grammy Award winner for Best Engineered Album. And it really kind of changed the way I think about mixing music. First off, what is a reference track? A reference track is what it sounds like. It's a track that you can reference to see if your project is moving in the right direction and if you're making the right moves. You can use this track to make sure that your vocals are as loud as they should be. You can use it to check just general balance. You can use it to get inspiration for maybe some of your decisions with panning or automation or what have you. It helps you to, I guess, have a target to keep you honest. And so you should find tracks that you know and love. They don't always necessarily need to be in the exact same genre as the music you're making, but that does help. Will you mix something as fantastic as your favorite award-winning track? Well, maybe not. But if you have a target, then that can get you closer than you would be without it. Even mixing engineers, and again, this was from Trina Shoemaker, who has decades of experience, will still make use of reference tracks. So import the track right into your mixing session, into your digital audio workstation, and refer to it often. The last thing I'll say on this, just to really convince you of the power of this, is think of it like sports. I used to play hockey a lot when I was a kid. And the biggest improvement that I saw in my skills was when I went up against players who were older and much better than I was, because I was able to model their moves and strive to just kind of see and play the game like they did and observe what they were doing. And that's kind of how it goes with making and mixing music. And so that's where reference tracks can just keep you honest and say, no, this is the pinnacle. This is what I should be striving for. So, okay, that's your tip of the day, and hopefully that helps you out. And if you haven't used them before, definitely use reference tracks. And now we're going to switch gears a bit, and we're going to be talking about getting started with music production. And a lot of people may just have a song idea they want to record, or they may have a desire to just get started and they don't know where to begin. Or maybe they're overwhelmed by all there is to know, or think that they don't have, because they can't get a degree in audio engineering, that they won't be able to make music. And this is faulty thinking. Getting started in music production is actually easier than it ever has been before. And to help me chat about this, I am very excited to have my good friend Ben Runyan talking with us, and he goes by the alias, or he's been working under the alias Just Process, and he's working on his latest album. And he has a ton of experience both learning music production and teaching it. So, Ben, how you doing today, man?
Doing great. I'm going to introduce myself as everyone would on a YouTube video or a podcast by starting off by saying, "Hey, guys."
Exactly. You have to do it, right?
Literally every video starts with "Hey, guys." So it's only fair that I do that here.
Yeah. So, but things have been going well. You've been keeping pretty busy, right? I mean, I've been following you on Facebook, and it seems like you're just you're just doing cool stuff every day. It seems like your new album's coming together, and it's just been a process.
Just process, yeah. It's been a wild ride. I'm teaching at Drexel University, Rowan University in Glassboro in New Jersey. It looks like I might be doing some production workshops at University of the Arts in Philadelphia, and I'm working on my Just Process album, and doing stuff like this, talking on cool shows like yours with Audio Skills. Yeah, just trying to keep busy and keep doing what I love. That's the blessing.
Right on, right on. So, Ben, can you real quick, before we get into, talking about people starting out in music production, can you just give us a little more information about just your experience in music production? You've been at this for a while, really.
Sure. Yeah. Obviously, to start with, I think, kind of goes without saying, but maybe it doesn't, is passion. If you don't have passion, it's not going to push you through long nights of no results, to quote
Sure.
Brian. You have to be a bit of a masochist to really want to get into something like this. You have to be a bit of a perfectionist, a masochist, a narcissist, self-critical, a variety of sometimes polar, paradoxical qualities that you have to really survive or make it at all, or really even make a little bit of dough in this industry. So the first thing you have to have is passion. And the second thing is you have to know how to find out the I don't know, because there's a lot of things that I don't know. And, I'm 10, 12 years into this and I constantly don't know. And you have to be really good at finding that out, whether that's Google or YouTube or asking a friend. Developing a language that music producers speak. Language is very, very important. And when I say that, what I mean is that when I started producing, there was a lot of things that I can hear in my head that I knew wasn't right about my mix, or something that I wanted to achieve in someone else's mix. And I didn't have the language like gain structure or noise floor or dynamics or buses or all these different types of things that's part of the lexicon of a producer. That's
Right.
the biggest thing to do, is to start off is by understanding the language, reading enough magazine or books or whatever to have that language. But I got started by being very interested in electronic dance music in the early 2000s, when I had friends that went on high school trips to Germany and brought back CDs of music that I wasn't hearing over here in the States. While I, have been involved in making rock and roll records and records that aren't necessarily dance production, I've always been influenced by that sound, and that's what made me want to start making and mixing records.
Right on. And I think you touched on some really interesting points there in terms of learning the language and kind of starting from that point. So actually part of this, what advice would you have for people who are just starting out and maybe they're overwhelmed by all there is to know? How might they keep focused and not get discouraged? Is there like hey, start by learning this thing or
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. What I did was basically this. I went to Barnes and Noble a lot. I went to Borders when it existed, rest in peace. And, and when, any magazine store I could, and I always would pick up a copy of Computer Music Magazine. Computer Music Magazine is a great magazine. Now, there's lots of others like Sound on Sound and Future Music and all these different ones, but some of those kind of lend more to the professional and, advanced learner segment of the population. But a magazine like Computer Music, which I do believe is a United Kingdom import, so it is a little bit expensive. That really got me started off by reading about different digital audio workstations, reading about things like compression, reading about things like EQ, and developing, number one, the language that I was speaking about, and number two, a general understanding of the playing field and who were the players in the different genres of music. That way, much to your first point about reference tracks, it allowed me to critically listening. And with my students at the different universities I teach at, I always stress, active listening versus passive listening, and being able to listen critically and understand and be able to group instruments by frequency range or group them by type so that you can understand what is involved in the panorama, the dimension, and the stereo image of a modern production.
Right on. No, that's really really good point there. So, and I think you were kind of touching on this, a lot of people might be into music production and they want to learn this stuff, but they don't have the time or necessarily the finances to afford a full-on degree in it, and be able to take a whole degree program. Besides obviously checking out audio skills and things like that.
Yeah, of course.
Just a little plug there. But what advice would you have for them? I guess, one of the things would be, hey, get a magazine. But was there anything else? Yeah,
I mean, the first thing would be get a magazine. I mean, the second thing would be activating your kinesthetic learning ability. When I say kinesthetic, I mean, there's a couple ways of learning, or I guess there's a few. There's visual, there's audio, and there's kinesthetic. You can sit in a classroom and somebody can tell you to do something, and that helps a little bit. Or, you can read through a PowerPoint or a YouTube video, and that's, marginally helpful, I suppose. But unless you're actually physically doing and trying to enact what you're trying to learn, you're never going to know, because there's two things with, there's I don't know, and there's I don't know what I don't know. And I think that people starting out especially don't know what they don't know. And that's very scary, because if you don't know what you don't know, well, then you can't figure it out. But if you know what you don't know, then you can educate yourself about it, and you don't necessarily need some sort of degree to do it. Now, obviously, if you have the privilege or opportunity to pursue a degree, it will absolutely help you. I'm a millennial. Sure. I would be the first person to tell you that something isn't worth it if it wasn't. But, I do look back at my time in college, and I do see that, even if it was only 3 or 4 classes that really shaped who I am as a person and my passion and my understanding of the world, every bit of the money was worth those 3 or 4 things. Because if I didn't have that, I don't know how I would have arrived at this point. That being said, the best thing you can do for yourself is download demos. Ableton Live has a free demo. Download it, mess around with it, develop questions. And when you can develop those questions, there's probably someone in your circle of friends, or at least on your Facebook feed, that can point you to someone else that can kind of get you jump started on things. And that way, you're going to have enough time to start developing your own questions about where you want to go. And at that point, maybe you can start pursuing some sort of, instructional opportunity.
Yeah, no, that's good. So I guess the basic takeaway would be like, dip your foot in, get a magazine, do these kinds of things, but you actually just have to kind of start doing it, and you got to kind of stumble around in the dark a little bit. Yeah.
There's no manual. And to be honest, who reads manuals anyway, on Christmas morning, did you open up your present and read the manual before, you used your Kinect set or your Erector set or, your PlayStation? No, you just turn the thing on and see what happened.
Yep. So, okay, now this kind of leads to it. And a lot of people who might get started, this is one of their first questions, and it's a frustrating question, and I've kind of got my answers to it, but I'm really curious to know what yours is. People always ask, well, what's the best DAW? Digital audio workstation. What should I choose? What's right for me? What advice would you give to someone who is trying to decide, they want to start out and they're like, well, I don't know. Just tell me which one. Which one should I do?
Sure. Well, let me address that in sections. First of all, I know, everybody knows that that's a loaded question. Yes. Because number one, it depends. Everybody's brain works differently, and so you're going to respond differently to different digital audio workstations. If you had asked me 2 years ago, I would have said I've been using Ableton for 8 years, and it's the only way to fly, and everything else is garbage. Now I use Logic 10, and I think that's the best thing in the world. I used Cubase back in college, and even right at the beginning when I first started off, I used Fruity Loops. So I've used a million different ones. And even in that, and even though I currently like Logic because of its mixing environment and its what I think are higher quality plugins and kind of more professional Pro Tools like Arrange page and mixing environment, I used to use Ableton a lot, and sometimes I even use them in conjunction. Ableton, in terms of creative workflow and ideas and forming ideas and putting them together, is better than all of them far and away. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I would find it hard pressed to argue that anyone else is better at creative sketching than Ableton is. That being said, in terms of a value for $199, Logic has more sounds,
that's crazy.
professionally updated sounds, higher quality plugins. And, I'm not a conspiracy person, but I actually believe, and, I'm sure a million people would say I'm really dumb for saying this. I actually believe that Logic's bounce down sound sounds cleaner than Ableton's. And I think that has to do because of Ableton's warping algorithms in the audio waveforms. But that could be a tinfoil hat thing. I don't know. And there was a third part there.
No, I think you made really, really good points. I think if I could kind of maybe sum it up, and you can say, if you agree, but there is no one perfect DAW. A lot of it depends on what you're comfortable with and what your workflow is. It might go back to what we were saying about just getting started. So just download, a trial of a DAW and try to play around with it.
That's my life motto.
Yeah, I might say that there are DAWs that might, especially if you're like a real beginner and you're just completely unsure. Like I love GarageBand because that's what I started with, because it was just very easy and it was like not too overwhelming because it didn't have all these buses and things like that. Exactly. So basically just get started, and there is no, if you start with a digital audio workstation and it's just not working for you, there are so many out there, try another one.
Oh, and the last thing I'll say about that real quick is this, that, if I know a bunch of people, and this has kind of been a recent development, that are getting their start on iOS or mobile, tablets with things like Korg Gadget or GarageBand for iOS, or, there's a variety of different ones, Native Instruments Machine, and some of those are pretty freaking impressive, especially the Korg Gadget I've been starting to mess around with. Pretty incredible value for what you get on there. Now, can you start and finish an entire project on iOS? Yeah, I guess you could. I don't really think that mobile music production is quite there yet. I'm sure there would be some people that would argue that that's not the case. But I do still believe that a mouse is a little bit more outfitted for, an arrange page than the finger is.
Sure. Right on. So, we've been talking about a lot of Mac products here. And this is like the other question that I see a lot of people who are getting started out ask, and they say, well, Mac versus PC. What should I do? And obviously you and I are both Mac guys.
Well, I should probably recuse myself. I work for Apple, so yeah. No, but I'll keep going. I'll answer the question honestly.
Yeah, but does it well, two questions. One, does it really matter? And then two, just be honest, why do you go for Mac when it comes to music production?
Sure. Does it really matter? God, probably not. Before 2010, I had an HP Pavilion that I worked on Ableton on, and I couldn't not finish a project or something.
Right.
It's not like it withheld me from doing that. Honestly, no, it probably doesn't matter. It obviously matters in that you can't use Logic or GarageBand on a PC. I mean, just from a sheer, preference point of view, I have an iPhone, and that was the first device I had from Apple. And so I wanted a Mac. I like Mac OS. I think it's a bit simpler. And really just from a statistics standpoint, it's not that Apples or Macs cannot get viruses, although they are of a more closed architecture than PC computers. But, they really do only make up about 5% of the market share, even though, Apple's a much bigger company than any of those other companies. And so in that, hackers are less, have less incentive to maliciously attack your computer. So they're safer from that standpoint. The other thing I will say, and I do believe this, even though I'm obviously biased, is that I've had PCs last 2 or 3 years, and sure, you might grab one for $499, but if, in a combination of 6 years, you're grabbing 2 computers that are both $500, well, then that's $1,000. And I've had, my MacBook Pros last 7-8 years, at, $1,100 a pop. So I do think there's a better support system for the computers. I think Apple has paid a ton of attention to Logic, which I've been very impressed with their updates. And, I like the, when I work on my songs, I drop them into my iCloud Drive. I have the app right on my phone. I can check them against my, other mixes and my reference tracks, and then, walk down the street.
The ecosystem is
it's the ecosystem. Yeah. That's just, it's comfortable to me, and there's no incentive for me to leave. So it might just be kind of a creature of comfort thing at this point. But, to answer the question, no, it probably doesn't matter.
Yeah, no, I think that that really explains it. So if someone's out there and you've got a PC and, you've got a limited budget, don't feel like, oh, well, I need to come up with $2,000 to get all this Mac stuff, because you just don't. No. That's not true. Yeah. Cool. So now, kind of speaking to that and sort of getting equipment and things like that, a lot of people, the next step is they're like, okay, I've got the inspiration. I know what software I want to use. I got my computer. They get overwhelmed by all the equipment that they will need to get to start recording from home.
Sure.
And producing or what have you. What would you say are the essential things you need?
Sure.
And if there anything that maybe isn't essential, but you're like, this might really jumpstart someone who's newer?
Absolutely. Number one, you need a decent computer. So while, per my last, answer, no, it doesn't matter necessarily PC or Mac, you have to invest in a computer, and you have to spend money, whether it's PC or Mac, in a reliable computer that's going to last you at least 5 to 7 years. You have to do it. That is the cornerstone of your production suite. You just have to do it. You have to get it done. Number two, you need to purchase a digital audio workstation. Number three would be an audio interface. And the audio interface simply just to record things on microphone or direct in from a guitar or a bass, and be able to connect with studio monitors that you should get at some point. I say this to everyone. It seems like a nice idea that you can mix on headphones, and to a degree you can, but you cannot mix on headphones. You have to have actual reference monitors, or you're going to put the mix in your car and the bass is going to sound ridiculous. You just can't hear things on your headphones. It's just physically impossible. The other thing I would say is get a membership to Splice, and they're not paying me, so I'm not plugging them. Not yet, at least. Splice, I was introduced to, and this is a great thing about music production, by a 16-year-old kid, and I didn't even know about it. But it's $7.99 a month. It stores all your projects to the cloud, and it gives you 100 credits a month towards downloading any sample from every sample pack that is out there. So instead of paying $40 for one sample pack, where you're going to use 4 or 5 samples, it's 100 credits a month to download any sample from any genre at any BPM, at any type, at any genre, all that stuff. That's made a huge difference in my music making, especially when I'm trying to achieve a certain genre or compete with the musical landscape out there. The fifth thing, or whatever, 6, or what you might have noticed that I've omitted, is a MIDI controller. Yeah. I honestly don't think you need one. I think that's one of the greatest myths. I mean, the musicians, as in people that are inherently musical or educated in that way, will, kind of probably scoff at that. And I assure you I'm not anti-musical, although I can't speak the language of music as eloquently as I can production. But I'm working on that. The MIDI controller, I've had so many people say, oh, I just bought this new MIDI controller, and it has all these knobs, and it has all these pads, and it's a freaking keyboard, man. It's a keyboard, and it's not going to make your music better. So should you have a keyboard? Yeah, get a $50 keyboard and call it a day. Every single cool, quote unquote, MIDI controller I've bought has been in my, my closet a month later, and I've never used it again. It's not going to make your music better. Gadgets don't make your music better. Knowledge makes your music better. So yeah, I honestly play my keyboard on the actual keys, or I click in MIDI notes and begin chord progressions that way. Or I use things like Ableton and I hum harmonies, and I use Ableton's MIDI to harmony or harmony to MIDI and form things that way. So there's a ton of innovative ways that you can, start creating music without a MIDI controller. If you can afford a nice one, sure, yeah, get one. But, more often than not, when I'm composing and creating, I do not have a keyboard attached to my computer. Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and kind of to do the flip side of that, I have one, but for me, I play the piano. So for me, that is just how my mind worked
musically. I'm like, that helps me. But that's by no means a requirement. And I think an important thing with all of these, talking gear, talking software, all that kind of stuff, it's how does your mind work? And when you're creating music or things like that, what are you actually going to use? If you've never played a piano before, then is a MIDI controller the absolute most important thing?
Sure.
Or would it be easier to just kind of use your keyboard on your computer and do what you were talking about, Ben, and kind of use some of those tools?
Sure. And there's nothing to be afraid of. And I think, especially speaking to the musicality, I think, so right. In your case, you play piano. That's the way you were taught. So it works for you. And that's great because that's how your brain works. But, I think sometimes people scoff at entering in MIDI and building chord progressions as though it's not the modern equivalent of scoring a music sheet.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't see a difference. I look at MIDI and I hear music, whereas, Mozart looked at, a staff sheet and he saw music. So it's, tomato.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So now this is actually perfect segue to this question here. You mentioned earlier that you aren't, you are not some super musician, playing symphonies and things like that. What advice would you have for someone who wants to get into music production,
Sure.
but they may not have the experience or knowledge playing an instrument or really any formal music training, traditional music training at all?
Well, there's going to be a disclaimer at the front. If you do not have music in your head, if you do not have a musical ear, if you're not constantly humming harmonies, God help you.
You got to have some kind of music.
Yeah, exactly. There's got to be something in there. Or, I would love to be a quarterback in the NFL. That's been a dream of mine since birth, honestly. I'm obsessed with football. I know more about football than I probably do music.
Right, go Eagles.
Yeah, go Birds. I don't think the Eagles will be calling me for open tryouts anytime soon. So I do not have the physical skill set to accomplish that. So I wish I could. Maybe I could be a punter or something. I can kick the ball pretty far. So that being said, my mind just went blank. What was the question?
So the question is if you don't have that musical background, that traditional musical background,
sure.
how do you, what advice might you have?
I can actually offer a direct service for that. That has been actually, no pun intended, instrumental in me working on my new record. And it is called hooktheory.com.
Hooktheory.com.
Yep. I spend $4 a month and it allows you to select a scale, major, minor, harmonic, whatever, Dorian, whatever it is, Mixolydian, and start building chord progressions by clicking on the chord, listening into it, and it will input MIDI. And then from there, you can export the chords to MIDI and pull them into your DAW and, change the sounds around and change the notes around, which is really, really great because, that's going to give you the skeleton of a song. In addition to that, it's got this great thing called the magic button. So if you're building a chord progression and you hit the magic button, it will offer up to you chords based on popular songs that have used it for effect in the way that you had started out. And then you can either accept it or reject it and cycle through different artists that have used a different chord after the ones you've put forward. So what you end up with is, your chord progression that you've created, but referenced against, popular chord progressions. I think that's a really, really great tool. Now, that being said, I don't necessarily start that off as my starter for every track I work on. Sure. I can feel my way around a piano and I can feel my way around a guitar. I can noodle around, so, even so much as the way I learned how to play piano was if I was playing a progression of some kind, I would figure out in that progression, all right, what keys on the keyboard can I not hit? What is definitely out, maybe one's kind of sour or sharp, but that might be kind of a bluesy kind of thing. But what can I literally not hit? What is not part of this? If you have an ear enough to figure that out, you're in good shape. And the third thing is that constantly have a voice or audio recorder on your phone, obviously, or whatever around you. I'm not going to give anything away, but I lift progressions from lots of songs all the time and find ways to hide them and then make them my own.
Oh, yeah.
There are only so many sounds and there are only so many notes in the Western forms of music. So it's literally impossible to make something quote unquote original. So I wouldn't make that your first goal. Everyone's like, yo, my stuff's like nothing you've ever heard before. Nobody can actually say that. I don't think that's even real. So my advice would just be, the only way you're going to know what to start creating is trying to practice making other people's songs.
That's a really, really good piece of advice, and something that I've heard other songwriters I admire mention before. So that's awesome advice right there. So now here's kind of another piece of advice question. We're talking about working in software and producing music. What advice would you have for someone who is just starting to use plugins? Maybe they are just playing with reverb, or they're playing with different kinds of plugins and things. Do you have any tips or things that can make that go better for someone?
Sure. And this goes back to the language comment. There's really a couple words you're going to need to know. And if you're listening, write this down. Dry, wet, decay time, ratio, threshold, makeup gain. Honestly, if you can get those words down and be able to look at any plugin and to be able to reference those words on basically almost every type of plugin, then that's going to be a really good start for you.
Yep. No, I think that's a really good piece of advice. And I, just to kind of piggyback on that, I might also just say, kind of what we were talking about before, just open the plugin, just throw it on there and see what it's doing. Yep. See how it's changing the sound. Play with those settings and
change every knob.
And see what you like, because that's one of those things that I think sometimes, and we'll get into this just in a bit, but sometimes, for example, like compression, people are so intimidated by it, and it's just like, one of the things that was really eye-opening for me was when I learned from Trina Shoemaker down in New Orleans, and she's like, I'm not classically, I didn't go to school for engineering, so I couldn't tell you exactly how all of this compressor functions and all that stuff. All she knows is that she's like, I kind of want to compress this guitar a little bit or whatever. And she'll just throw it on there and just start playing with ratios and playing with the settings. And she's like, yeah, I like how that sounded cool. So I think take that, if you're just starting, that's someone who has been doing this for decades. And, here's Ben, saying the same thing, and me as well. Just throw it on there, because really what it is it's what sounds good, and these are just tools.
Right. Yeah, exactly. There are rules, and there are some finite rules.
Sure.
But for the most part, there kind of aren't. Barring like, there's kind of no rules. I mean, it's very loose. I mean, obviously, with distortion and gain structure and over compression and things like that, you do want to be working with the playing field that is out there, which goes back to the originality kind of comment I made. But try stuff, move things around, and don't be hard on yourself. I mean, I listened to old productions that I have made that I thought sounded really great at the time, and honestly, people still think they sound great. And I'm like, holy shit, I overcompressed the hell out of that track. Why did I do that? If I was going to mix it now, I would do it totally different.
Yep. I had the same thing. I've looked at some of the old things I've done, and I'm like, man, this just sounds like some cheesy 80s video game or something.
Exactly.
And I'm like, I guess that, whatever.
Yeah.
When at the time, I'm like, this is all right. This is my Grammy right here,
People used to give me the nickname Gain Crusher Runyan, because I would just over compress everything. They'd be like, yeah, man, you slap that 40-1 right on it and just crush it, and it's good to go.
Right on. So kind of related to plugins, and I think this is also really key for music production, and it's something that I still kind of work on myself. Do you have any advice for people starting to use loops or create their own loops? Just there's all sorts of, I feel like some people, there's just misinformation about loops, or people just don't understand.
Sure.
So do you have any advice or tips for people to do it well?
Well, that's a tough question. On one hand, there's a school of thought that says that's cheap or that's cheating or whatever.
Oh, I don't subscribe to that myself.
I don't know. I generally don't either. On the other hand, I think Love in This Club from Usher literally uses a GarageBand loop. So,
right.
Who's to say? I'm going to go back to my comment about that service called Splice. What's super awesome about it is that, generally speaking, before I would have to use a loop as a starting point, because that way I could build around it with MIDI. If I had already had a track going, finding a musical loop to fit to it would assume that I knew the key and scale, which I didn't necessarily based on my lack of knowledge. So that's going to be tough for introduction producers. However, with services like Splice, you can search and filter by key and scale and BPM so that you can fit in loops into your arrangements that have already been made. And then, obviously be aware of the pitch shifting functions in your DAW of choice, because maybe you might find a loop and you're like, wow, this sounds really good, but it's not in the same key. And, if it's somehow in the right scale, you might be able to pitch it down a couple semitones or 5 or 6 semitones and
get there.
Get it in there. And I had that on one of these tracks, which has this perfect guitar loop I heard. And I was like, I have to find a way to fit this in to the track. And I did. And then even on top of that, if there's 1 or 2 notes that are sour, but it's almost working, again, with the pitch shifting stuff, be aware with things like a flex pitch in Logic or being able to transpose individual sections in Ableton, and maybe you can move one of those notes into the progression.
Right on. So my next question, and, we could have a whole show on this. So, and I realize we've kind of got limited time here, but if you could, for someone who is just starting out, wanting to get into music production, they're going to hear a lot of stuff about this thing called compression. And can you briefly, as much as you can, explain compression and how it is used in music production for someone who's like, man, I don't...
I'm happy to, because literally yesterday I was giving a class on compression at Rowan University. And here's how I explained it. And here's how my college professor explained it to me, and how I learned, and how then I teach it, because I try to inject humor and memes into my classes so that
you got to do it.
Kids can understand.
The whippersnappers can get it.
That's how they get things. We're just returning to hieroglyphs. So I like memes too. Anyway, a compressor makes soft sounds louder, and it makes loud sounds softer. So it pushes items into a dynamic range. If you have a track and it's got drums and it's got vocals and they are already blaring, and you want to introduce a guitar and you really like its tone, but in part of the song the guitarist is lightly strumming on the guitar, and in another part he is really leaning into it, in the waveform, you might notice this great disparity between where the peak is in terms of decibel level. And so if you just throw that on the track, well, some of those more gentle moments might get lost. What a compressor will do is, if he's hitting it way too hard, it'll bring that peak down so it's not so jarring. And in the other part of the audio waveform, it'll bring those gentler moments up so that you can hear them, so that there's a consistency across the track. But what I can say about it is, this is the really weird analogy that I used, and I said, compression's a lot like Xanax. And here's why it's like Xanax. If you're having a bad day and you're prescribed this, obviously, I'll put that disclaimer on there. Please do not use pharmaceutical drugs that they prescribe them. I cannot recommend that, and it's against the law. If you're going to take Xanax, you have anxiety. If you have anxiety and you take one Xanax, it might be so that it's taking off the edge and helping your brain quiet down enough so that you can complete a task and so that you can get something done. So it's gently guiding you along and making you, let's say, better. Let's just use that word, more productive or calmer or more level-headed, right? But if you take 3 or 4, you're going to fall asleep and you're probably not going to know what's going on. It's going to make you worse. And when I say that, I mean, if you gently use compression, it can really bring out some great dynamics in your track and make things consistently better. If you do too much compression, it's going to take dynamics out, and it's going to make everything one way. And that one way is overcompressed, without dynamics, shrill, loud, and bad. So it's a very fine line between a compressor being a good tool and making everything much worse. And when I was talking about going back to my old songs, I just wanted to make things louder to compete with that landscape. So I just compressed the hell out of everything. And yeah, sure, it made it louder, but it also distorted things and makes it sound super crunchy and kind of like amateur hour. So,
right.
Even 10 years in, I still am learning about compression and just now starting to adhere to some of the general rules. Like I would say, if your compressor is doing a decibel reduction of more than 6 or 7 decibel levels, you're probably going to start to get some artifacts that sound like overcompression, which means that you have to go back into your mix and probably adjust some other things. So, it is a tool, and you gotta know how to use it because it can hurt people.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good overview of what compression is. And, again, the only thing I would say too is, there's always this fear of overcompressing. And yes, you want to be cognizant of that, and you don't want to crush it, but don't let that keep you from trying the tool out and using it, because it can, when used right, it can be the difference between a song that is like and something that sounds really good.
Or as I read on a meme page that I like, compress to impress.
There you go. So my second to last question here is, can you briefly go over equalization, EQ, and just real quick, what that is and how it is used in music production?
Absolutely. So I'm going to throw a word out for the audience, and that word is masking. And masking is when you have elements in a song that occupy the same frequency range. Now, obviously, as human beings, we are most attuned to the frequency range between about 1K and 5K, because that is where the human voice is heard evolutionarily or by design or whatever. I'm not going to get into that. We hear other people. That's what we need to hear to communicate. So that's where our ears are attuned to. So assuming that you chose your samples correctly, your synth patches correctly, and recorded correctly, and by correctly I mean with decent levels, not a lot of disparity in your decibel level, then you shouldn't have to EQ a lot. EQ doesn't necessarily fix things, and especially not generally speaking, in a boosting capacity. So I like to employ subtractive EQ, and I think the best example you could probably use is the relationship between the drum kits, more specifically the kick drum, and a bass line or a bass tone. Now, that's going to be one of the most important parts of the tracks also, because in the cases of people like Beethoven, who was deaf, he could still make music based on bass frequencies, and we like to hear bass and hip-hop music and blah, 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 blah. So, in that spirit, the kick drum and the bass line are often very competing frequencies. And so you probably want to get your oomph or your punch from the kick drum, and you probably want to get that warm, good feeling, that undertone from the bass. Generally speaking, not always. Sometimes the kick could sit below in the case of hip-hop, where 808s are the bass drum. But, if you just throw a kick and a sub bass on there, or a low bass tone, there's a good chance they're going to be competing in some way. Now, this is all subjective, so you could just leave it the way it is, but probably you're going to want to cut out a little bit of, let's say, 120 hertz in the bass line, so that kick drum can punch through, so that there's room for both. And the other piece of advice, that advice would also extend to guitar and vocals. So you're probably going to want to cut around 1 and 3K in the guitar or synth or things in that frequency range, so that the vocal can be heard clearly and isn't buried. Assuming you're going for a pop type production and not something indie where maybe the vocals are pushed back a little bit further. Now, the biggest piece of advice I have was also something I learned from my professor, and it is make it worse first. And what I mean by that is, if there's a frequency that you find annoying and you know that you don't want it in your song, grab your EQ, get a notch filter, and push up in the frequency range as far as you can and sweep until the sound you didn't like is 50 times worse.
Yep.
Once you heard that it's 50 times worse, you know that you're in the right spot. You bring that gain down, you go back down past 0, and you cut it out until it's to your liking. but only until you push it and find out where it's really bad can you really know where to cut.
Cool. Yeah. So bottom line, kind of wrapping up, EQ, it's essentially just being able to make surgical changes to specific frequencies on the spectrum, either through boosting or cutting. And I'd say there's additive or subtractive EQ. These are two kind of philosophies. Ben, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on with us today. This is really informational. Again, if you want to learn more about Ben's work, you can check him out at cityrain.info and be on the lookout for his new album under the moniker, I guess, Just Process, which is coming out. He's been working on it. I've been fortunate to hear some of his work, and it's sounding great. So I'm really looking forward to it myself. Thank you guys so much for joining us today, and for links and more information about today's show and our guest, you can check out our show notes at audioskills.com/podcast.
Ready to go even deeper with your recording, mixing, and music production? We've got all the info and techniques you need in one place so you can turn it up. Go to audioskills.com and access a huge library of video tutorials and private workshops so you make progress even faster. Come back next week for a brand new episode of the Audio Skills Podcast.